All right, good morning, everybody. Going to go ahead and get started this morning. I've asked Roger Sanders to lead us in a prayer as we get started this morning. Amen. All right, we're going to pick up in our study in Hebrews in chapter 8. So if you want to go ahead and turn over there. Trying to not create that feedback there. Okay. We're going to try, I know, like I said, every week as I get up here, I'm like, we can't recap the whole thing, but I'm going to try to do it really fast. I think just that repetition helps us kind of get in our mind's eye of kind of how this thing is flowing through from the beginning. So just a quick recap of what we've covered so far in our class, going through from chapter 1 in this letter or sermon or speech, however you want to call this, to this Jewish Christian audience. So chapter 1, if you guys remember, he kind of starts off this speech or letter with really kind of almost a thesis statement of this is who Jesus is. That Jesus is not only superior to angels. He spent some time kind of covering this comparison of Jesus versus the angels, and we kind of read a little bit of the backstory there, and it seems like there was definitely a group of kind of these, Jews in this particular time that were placing angels in a very high position, and in some cases even placing them above Jesus. And so we kind of see this kind of starting off this, that Jesus isn't only superior to angels, he's superior to everything because he's divine. He is the Son of God. And he starts quoting a lot from the Old Testament to kind of reference back and prove his point of what he's saying there. Chapter 2, he kind of moves on, and he's really pleading, after making this initial argument about who Jesus is and how he's superior, he kind of then starts pleading with these Jewish Christians to not fall away, right? And we talked a lot about that, and then this kind of drifting away process that seems like was taking place. And, really the crux of that being that if you're not putting Jesus in the position that Jesus deserves to be in, that is where you start becoming in danger of this falling away process. That is something that will cost you your salvation. Chapter 3, he then kind of moves on and starts, again, making a lot of comparisons, again, back to things that the Jews and kind of this Hebrew nation were holding in such a high place. And he starts making this comparison of Jesus to Moses, right? And we talked about how, he makes the point that Moses was faithful over God's house and as kind of the people of Israel as a servant, but Jesus was faithful over God's house as a son, more than just a servant, as God's son. And so, putting your hope in Moses is one thing, but if you're not putting your hope in Jesus, you're kind of missing the point. And he spends a lot of time talking about how, kind of referencing back to the account of the Israelites coming out of the wilderness and how they had a heart that was not soft. It was not there to follow God. They were rebellious, and they did not follow God. And those people died. They died in the wilderness. They did not receive that rest that we talked a lot about. He kind of spills over into chapter 4, talking about this rest that God promises in Scripture. And we kind of spent a lot of time going through that. But, that rest is not possible without Jesus. And so we talked about Jesus. He kind of there in chapter 4, he kind of starts getting into this discussion that really has kind of carried us through since that time about Jesus being this great high priest. And we've spent a lot of time on that, and we're going to spend some more time on that today. Chapter 5, right, he starts to unpack this kind of mysterious figure of Melchizedek, and we spent a little bit of time talking about Melchizedek and really comparing Jesus to this kind of Old Testament kind of priest king that was a very unique thing that we talked about, and we didn't see someone that was the high priest and the king of Israel, but you kind of see this man before all of those things were established with the covenant with Moses and the law and all those things. So kind of precedes all of that stuff. And so we talked a little bit about that, and he really kind of gets into an aside there in chapter 5 that, hey, there's a lot of stuff to say about this, but we're going to kind of derail for a second because you guys really aren't in a position to even hear it. You've been dull of hearing. You're not growing in your faith as you should be. We're going to have to go back and cover a lot of the basics again. And so he really kind of puts them on blast a little bit there. But then he comes back in chapter 6, and he kind of goes from a little bit of this shaming to kind of some encouragement. Again, he's trying to bring them back to this certainty of God's promise. We talked about God making this oath and swearing on himself that the things that he's promised are going to come to truth or come to fruition. And we talked about how he mentions here that this is a steadfast anchor of the soul, and it's really the thing that you can put your hope and put your trust in, because God has not only said he's going to do it, he's sworn himself that he's going to make this thing come to pass. Jesus is the forerunner. He's our forever high priest, and he follows after this order of this kind of shadowy figure, Melchizedek, which we've said we wouldn't really have any good understanding of who that guy was if we don't have this being revealed to us by this writer and through the Holy Spirit. And then so this past week we were in chapter 7, and this was really kind of getting into kind of explaining more of this kind of what would seem to be sort of a random encounter with this guy Melchizedek. Kind of explains that more, and then really starts digging into the differences between the Levitical priesthood and this priesthood of Melchizedek that Jesus is kind of following in that order. So as we finished chapter 7 on Wednesday, we were really talking about Jesus as our high priest, and he saves to the uttermost. If you guys remember that phrase there, something that the Levitical priests just couldn't quite do that. So he's not only superior to them, but at the same time, he does sympathize with our feelings and our infirmities, and we can have that as our anchor of the soul. So we're going to pick up today, like we said, chapter 8. So I did a pretty fast run through of that. We're going to pick up in chapter 8. We're going to try and cover verses 1 through 6 today, and we're going to try and cover the rest of it on Wednesday night. So I'm just going to read. We're going to pick up in Hebrews chapter 8, verses 1. We're going to read down through 6, and then we'll start kind of working through this. So he says, Now the point in which we're saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve as a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. All right, so we're going to kind of work through those first 6. I know we're going to kind of spill over, I'm sure, into the rest of the chapter because it's kind of hard to separate those things, but we're trying to kind of keep a one chapter a week cadence here. So verse 1, we have to love whenever a writer in the Bible says, here's what I'm trying to say, right? I think we can all appreciate that. That's kind of nice when they're just blunt enough with us to just say, this is the point we're trying to make here. But he goes on to say, we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. Got a question. So when you think about, we've talked a little bit about this, I think, earlier on, but why is it important that Jesus, if he's our high priest, why is it important that he's being described as seated or sitting? What does that imply?
The high priests in the old law, they stood when they went into the Holy of Holies to present the sacrifices and to do their work. Mm-hmm. And he's seated. He's there permanently. He is seated there.
Yeah, I think that'd be real easy to overlook. But think about, especially we're going to kind of read about this pattern, and we'll talk about the tabernacle and the temple. But when you think back to the tabernacle, were there any chairs inside the tabernacle? there was one seat in the tabernacle. Weren't supposed to be sitting in that seat. So if you were the high priest going into the temple, you were active. You were standing. You were doing things, right? You were offering sacrifices. Yeah, there was no sitting. So for Jesus to be described as our high priest and he's going and he's sitting, I think there's some significance there. We're going to kind of unpack that.
You could also say that signifies that he has his work done.
That's right. We're going to definitely talk about that, yeah. When we think about, I want to go back to this, we kind of alluded, there was a place to sit in the tabernacle or in the temple, in that Holy of Holies. What was that seat? The mercy seat, right? So if we think about the mercy seat a little bit, what was the mercy seat? And what was that all about?
For God to meet and dispense justice and mercy.
Yeah.
The cherubim were on each side, and there were no windows in the Holy of Holies. So when the high priest went in, the incense was going in there, and it would have been a somber moment when you went into the Holy of Holies.
That's where they met with God.
It was very special. It was kind of a off-limits place to be other than very specific circumstances. When could you go into where the mercy seat was?
Once a year.
Once a year. And who could go in?
The high priest.
The high priest. You have one person that could go in there one time a year. And what were they doing when they went in there?
Sprinkling blood, ashes.
Do we get the sense that they went in and spent a whole lot of time in there? Probably not. I kind of get the sense that they went in, they kind of did their thing, and they got out. It was like, I don't want to necessarily be in here longer than I need to because this is I don't belong in here really. I mean, realistically, I don't really belong in here.
The presence of God in there was kind of a terrifying thing.
Yeah.
You get that in all honesty. Their job wasn't done. Christ's job was done.
That's right.
Okay? And I think there's a whole different situation. And if they need to understand what he's trying to tell them, you need to understand something.
Yeah.
It's altogether different.
Yeah.
Back to the, he sat down, the king sat.
Mhm.
So they've been comparing Christ to Melchizedek, who was the high priest and king.
Yep.
So I think this may also be kind of a reference that he was the king and he could sit down.
Yeah. There is an authority being established here, right? This is what Jesus has done is not like anything else that has been done before. So yeah, you guys are hitting all the points. I think this is exactly where I was trying to go with it, and kind of what we see here. Not to be making too much of a deal of it, but I think there is significance.
It also comes to my mind that Christ's redemptive work on the cross is done. On the cross he said it's finished.
Yeah, I had that as a note here too. For him to say these things, it is signifying the work he's done as high priest. He's done that sacrificial work, and he's seated. He's not active. He's not offering sacrifices daily anymore in the way that the Levitical priests were doing. Yeah, so absolutely. Back to what you were kind of alluding to, Marcia. Is there any significance to Jesus being at the right hand of the throne? I think we talked about this a little bit maybe early on, but him being at the right hand of the throne of the Father, what is that implying? What's the significance there?
First place.
It's kind of premium status and authority and...
Under the old law, to sit at the right hand of the king was an honor. And Christ is the most honorable of any person who's ever lived.
Yeah.
And he's the son of the king. He is the king.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I had an interesting note in here. Dad had done a little research and some reading, and he had a note in here about the Sanhedrin, which I think most everybody's familiar with. The Sanhedrin was kind of like the Jewish Supreme Court. And interestingly, there were some notes in here that basically you always had two scribes or kind of these lawyers that were basically before those judges of the Sanhedrin, and one would kind of sit on the right hand and one would sit on the left hand. And it was interesting that the scribe that was always on the right hand was the one who was writing the acquittals, and the one who was on the left was the one that was writing kind of the punishments or the condemnation. So I don't know if that, I don't know if we're making something out of nothing there, but that is kind of an interesting kind of fact there about kind of who was seated at the right hand. We think about Jesus being the one who is offering this sacrifice for forgiveness of sins.
We even today talk about, well, he's the right-hand man of
Mm-hmm.
of the president or
That's right.
Whomever. And that's
Trusted and,
by
Yep.
authority, like Jim said. It's just preeminence.
Absolutely. Bob.
And it's a fulfillment of the prophecy of David. We read that the Messiah would be seated at the right hand in Psalms 110.
That's right. So I got a question. Are believers, are Christians, are they ever going to sit on the throne with Jesus? If you go to Revelation chapter 3, right, and these are kind of in those letters or addresses to the different churches, you've got this passage here talking to the church at Laodicea. And it's pretty interesting. He goes through and, when we think about Laodicea, I know your works, you're either hot or cold, and kind of goes through that whole thing. Those whom I love, and down in verse 19, those whom I love, I reprove and discipline, so be zealous and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him and he with me. And the one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. That's a pretty amazing thought. That's probably not where our minds go. That is pretty overwhelming to think about that. For Jesus to have gone and sat at the throne with his Father and him to basically offer that to us, to those of us that conquer through him as well. Pretty incredible.
Kind of interesting, that statement, I will come and eat with him. That's kind of a covenant relationship. That's a sign of covenant to eat with someone.
Yep.
It's like Melchizedek and Abraham, that sort of thing. So that's kind of a covenant sign.
Yep. This, as we've kind of said, even in our quick recap, there's been a lot of kind of warnings to these Jewish Christians as it kind of goes through the letter, and we're going to see more of that again as we keep going. But this continuous warning of kind of drifting or falling away, which they seem to be in danger of, and similar warnings there in Revelation about the things that are going on. But there's that comfort of Jesus being that ultimate high priest, and that he is going to help us overcome and be victorious. So it's encouraging there, just as it's been encouraging reading through Hebrews. Now, I think we mentioned this in an earlier chapter, and we're already on the topic of seating positions, seating, standing, and all these things. Now that his work's finished, is Jesus, is he always seated? I think we mentioned this before, but is he always seated?
Not when Stephen was stoned, said he stood.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this in one of our classes earlier on, but we would go back to Acts chapter 7, and it says, when they heard these things, they were cut to the heart, and they gnashed at him with their teeth. But he, being full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God, and said, Look, I see the heavens open, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. I think it's, again, I don't know if you're making too much out of something that's not there, but when we talk about Jesus, you guys mentioned, Jesus' redemptive work is finished. I mean, he has offered this sacrifice once and for all, but at the same time, it's a powerful thought to think that Jesus is active. We've talked about him being our mediator. It's very powerful, I think, to recognize that he is active in that mediation process, and he's standing there in that moment where Stephen is going through what he's about to go through.
It's kind of interesting that Stephen was talking to people who should have known God's word and who should have recognized what Jesus did and saw and all the signs and wonders that and Stephen recalls all the history leading up and you see Jesus standing, he's indignant at what's happening to Stephen after he tells him the truth.
And that's kind of what he's talked about in those warnings about the rebellious heart that the people had coming out of Egypt. And, they should have been able to see these things, and it's unfortunate. All right, so verse 2, a minister in the holy places in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. So, we're still talking about Jesus, how he's superior as the high priest, and we know that Jesus is superior because, like we just said, he's seated at the right hand of God. He's got God's approval, and he's done these things. That's kind of this first point he's making there. But where is this throne that Jesus is really making what Jesus is doing superior to the Levitical priesthood, right? We've kind of been doing these comparisons as the writer's been going through. Where is this throne that he's seated? It's not a trick question. In heaven. It's in heaven. Jesus is ministering in a superior sanctuary, if you want to think of it that way, right? So the Levitical priests, where were they ministering? On earth, yeah. On earth in a tabernacle or temple made with hands in this kind of earthly realm, domain. And, here, Jesus, he's ascended to heaven. I mean, we read about that at the end of the gospel accounts, the beginning of Luke. Jesus is in heaven. He's serving in his ministry in a superior way to those Levitical priests.
It's kind of crazy to think that the tabernacle is a pattern of the things that were in heaven.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was kind of where I was going to go next. It says, it says the true tent that the Lord set up. What's the implication of that? He's serving in the true tent, not one that was made with hands. What is that implying?
The tabernacle and the temple were shadows of this true tent. They were never the true tent.
Yeah. There is a I guess, ultimate form of what we would think of the tabernacle or temple. There is something that is better. The things that were here were kind of a copy and a shadow, as he kind of says in a minute, but they were not this kind of perfect form of where God was going to dwell and be worshipped.
It's a glimpse of it in Revelation, but it's amazing.
Yeah, I know you had that in your notes. I thought that, I don't know how often I've really sat and thought about that, but we kind of know this passage that, well, yeah, we know that the tabernacle and the temple is not the real thing, but even like the items that were in there that were supposed to be in there, like the ark and all those things were copies of something that we're going to maybe see in kind of its true form one day, and that's kind of an incredible thought. How majestic those things are probably going to be. He does not, so Jesus is superior. He's not ministering kind of this shadowy temple here on earth in the way we've kind of seen from the Levitical priesthood. He's in the real deal place. And when you think about that, when God gave the instructions for building that original tabernacle, and then later as the temple that King Solomon builds, how long were those supposed to last? If we kind of think about that, were they supposed to be forever? No, at best they were temporary. They were not supposed to be the thing that was going to be where God dwelled forever. And we know that because did God dwell forever in those places? His glory left. Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, I think it's really important as we study through this that the Hebrew writer really, and this is kind of why a lot of people think that Paul may have been the writer of Hebrews, because he made so many arguments in other epistles about this very same thing. Like in Galatians 3, we know that near the end of the chapter, it tells us that the old law is not for nothing. It was not given for no reason at all. It was given so that we could learn about God, that we could learn about what he expects from his people, and that it was a school or a tutor to bring us to Christ. So all of those things were in preparation for us to, and for people of God to understand who the Father is, understand what he expects of us, and finally to bring us to perfection through Christ. So this is a great argument that he's laying down here, and this is a great but it is really important to understand that the old law tells us a lot of what God expects, which is why, just for instance, and I'll try to only make one point here, which is why, for instance, a lot of people still tithe. Well, the tithe was a real thing under the law.
Yeah.
Does the New Testament ever specifically tell us how much to give? No. But the tithe was there. So you make your choice, right? And so it's little things
Yeah.
like that we learn from the old law.
Yeah, we talked, I can't remember, in the last couple of weeks we've talked about that, right? The appreciation that we can have about any of this. If we didn't have the old law, if we didn't understand these things or have the history, none of this, we wouldn't be able to grasp it, right?
There'd be no reference point.
Yeah, exactly. I have Galatians 3 somewhere in here, yeah. Yeah, exactly. So back to this thought, just kind of wrapping this up about the temple and the tabernacle and kind of these copies. I mean, we're going to see that again, I think, in a second. But if you guys recall back to John chapter 4, and you've got this interaction between Jesus and the woman at the well. And I've always been impressed with that because the question she asks is like a great question. Sometimes we kind of think, wow, well, they should have known this. I mean, she was like kind of asking the right stuff. And you remember Jesus' response there was that he says, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you'll neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship him." So we kind of think through those things, and it's very clear. There was a point to the tabernacle. There was a point to the temple that was built, but those that wasn't the ultimate purpose. That was never the intent for those things to be, a physical place that was going to last forever, and they were just kind of copies of this true form of what God wanted.
Jay,
Yeah.
I think I'll say it a little different way. You're making the same
Sure.
point, but I think sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking that Jesus as the high priest, the heavenly throne, the heavenly temple, that kind of thing was sort of the next phase or evolution of what we see in the Old Testament. But that's kind of the wrong, we ought to think about it as that was the real one all along. Stuff in the Old Testament was just a shadow of it.
It was just trying to help us understand that. Yeah.
It was never the real one that evolved into the better one. The better one was the idea all along. These other temporary things were just to give us a little.
It wasn't like, hey, we're living in this apartment while our house is getting built kind of thing. That was always the intent, but for us to even kind of get a grasp of it. And I was thinking through about, how did Jesus teach? Did he just come right out and say stuff usually in his ministry? He taught in parables, and it's kind of in a similar fashion here. He was using things that we could kind of have as a reference point to help us understand something that was bigger and better. And in a similar way, kind of the Old Testament here is doing that for us. It's helping us kind of prime us to understand the things that are really there.
God's whole purpose was to get back to the Garden of Eden relationship. Back from the garden to the New Jerusalem. That was God's goal.
So verse 3, "For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest to also have something to offer." Have we heard this phrase, gifts and sacrifices, before? In 5th chapter, right? So not that long ago, we were just talking about this. Back in Hebrews 5, it says, "For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices." And we kind of talked a little bit about that back in chapter 5 of the different types of gifts and sacrifices. And we said, some of those things were free will offerings, and some of them were kind of more mandatory offerings, for forgiveness of sins. And so we just talked a minute ago about the Day of Atonement, and that happened how often? Once a year. So what, there was the Day of the Atonement. Why did the Israelites offer so many sacrifices? Why were there so many other sacrifices just going on all the time?
Because they were so sinful.
Yeah, I think so. Yep. They were so sinful, and so they had to do them for what reason? For what purpose? What'd you say?
To get forgiveness.
To get forgiveness, and what did that forgiveness enable them? To approach God. Yeah, to be right with God, have peace with God, right? And the short answer as a parent, because he said so, right? So, I mean, that was kind of the other reason. He demands sacrifice from sinful man because God's holy, and if we're going to approach him, we've got to be holy too, be right with him.
Very like the sacrifices for individuals' sins. As David told us, kind of was all encompassing the nation as well as everybody individually. So it was kind of like a grand sacrifice.
Yeah.
Atonement for everybody once a
Yep.
year.
So I was thinking through this, and I keep looking at Trey because I know Trey did that class on Leviticus, but there were lots of different types of sacrifices under the old law, and we kind of broke them into those kind of two buckets. But you had some of these voluntary sacrifices, so things like the burnt offering for unintentional sin, grain offering, peace offering, and then you had sin offerings, and you had trespass offerings that were kind of more of those, I guess, kind of mandatory if you want to think of it that way. So lots of different types of offerings or sacrifices that could be made. Why did God demand blood sacrifice for forgiveness of sins? What do we know from the scriptures about that? I mean,
It's always used to seal the covenant. So I think that's one of the reasons blood was the life of the animal.
and if we think too, I think, so back to Leviticus, Leviticus 17 kind of makes this statement or point about the significance of blood in the sacrifices we made. And God said in that passage, "For the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar." It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. Is it possible too here in these sacrifices that, again, these are shadows or copies, instruction, learnings for us to see the thing that was coming with Jesus? It seems that way to me, that for them to go through all of these sacrifices, and they're continually offering these blood sacrifices, and then for Jesus to come along and offer the one true blood sacrifice, it was preparing them for that. They should have seen that. We should be seeing that.
Kind of interesting, the Passover lamb would have been brought in and sacrificed at the exact same time Christ was crucified.
Yeah. There was definitely, that was the plan. That was the plan all along.
There was part of that too that was, there was a financial burden for the people to bring those sacrifices. For sure, the burnt offering. But it is interesting when you go through and look at the way that those things were carried out. There was definitely not this sense of, I've realized the guilt, and so now I've got to go do a guilt offering. I'm going to go drop that off at the priest and kind of stand back and watch him do it. There were a lot of, the people were actively involved.
Yeah.
Sometimes in the blood of the process. I mean, the priest did a lot of it, but to your point, it wasn't just, the way God designed it wasn't just to say, you're going to have to, there's a financial burden now, you're going to have to take one of your good animals that you were going to use for food, and you're going to have to bring it to me. That wasn't the idea. It was, there's a cost, and remember that I'm providing this anyway, but also, you're going to need to see and
You're going to be involved in this. Yeah.
Understand that there's a life being taken because of the situation here. So to your point, definitely the people would have been maybe more used to that idea than we are now of, maybe every once in a while it hits us that, man, Jesus had to give his life because of me. Every once in a while that really hits me in a unique way, but I think those people were probably kind of used to feeling that exchange of my guilt for life.
Yeah.
I think not only did they have to have a financial burden in their sacrifice, they got involved with the actual slaughter and preparing the offering, and it wasn't just.
It was a hands-on
it wasn't
experience.
just, hey, here, the priest, this is for my sin. They got involved and had to work at it.
Yeah.
looking at the whole picture. The perfection of Christ and his death was the whole purpose, the whole meaning. When sin came into the world, it seems that God tried to prepare and cultivate their minds way back in the Old Testament. The offering of blood of bulls and their sacrifices all led them and helped them to cultivate their minds and understanding, because if that didn't take place, and God knew well in advance, they wouldn't have a real appreciation for the death of Christ. And he was trying to help them to understand all along the way through prophecies in the Old Testament, right up to the New Testament.
We'd be getting to a point where, hey, is this really what was supposed to be happening?
They had to offer the perfect animals. They could not offer anything that had any blemish. And
They were supposed to be, anyways. Yeah.
that was to be acceptable.
Yeah.
And every one of these led up to the ultimate perfect sacrifice, the only sacrifice that could really forgive sins, which was Christ. He was the perfect sacrifice.
And that's a great segue, because I was going to ask, so we're making the point here in this Levitical priesthood, they were offering sacrifices daily. They were up. They were constantly, every day they were getting up and having to do these things. How many sacrifices did Jesus make? One. One's for all time, right? We're going to read, I'm kind of cheating, I'm getting ahead a little bit, but over in Hebrews 9, really confirming this symbolism of blood as life and how it applies back to kind of what we talked about from Leviticus. And it clearly states that these Old Testament blood sacrifices were temporary at best, and they were not going to completely redeem us in the way that Jesus was able to. And someone had mentioned, I forget now already, but who? But Jesus said, "It is finished." When he was on the cross and when he died, he said, "It is finished," and he gave up his spirit. So as far as sacrifice for sins are concerned, Jesus has done it. It is done. He is seated. There's nothing more to add to it. And I think that's really powerful for us to make sure we have that in our minds. So that being said, we're kind of making these comparisons to the Levitical priesthood and the sacrifices that were made in the old law, the old covenant. Are we supposed to still offer any sacrifices today? And what does that sacrifice look like? Is it the same? Is it a blood sacrifice in the way that what is it? A living sacrifice, right? A living sacrifice. Romans 12, I appeal to you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. So obvious kind of question here. How is that different than the Old Testament, than the Old Covenant? It's not a trick question. How is it different? How is our sacrifice different than the sacrifice?
Sacrifice yourself rather than the blood of goat, of animals.
Mm-hmm.
It's self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's a heart issue. The Old Testament, it should have been a heart issue for the Old Testament Jews, but it was a ritualistic, it was an outward act, and ours is to be heart condition every day, all day.
Heart is a big part of this. You guys are right. Heart's a big part of this, and we're going to get into that more on Wednesday night, obviously, as we kind of dig into the rest of this passage here. But
God said that he would put this into their minds and their hearts.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's right.
it's different in that sense.
That's right. We're gonna really dive into that on Wednesday and what that's all about. We already spoke about this. We already spoke about this in a previous class, but verse 4 says, "Now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law." We kind of already talked about this in a different class, but why would Jesus have not been a priest if he were an earthly priest in that way? Wrong tribe, right? He was from the tribe of Judah. And you had to be from the tribe of who to be? Levi, right? So he would have been disqualified. He would have not been an earthly priest in that same way. So again, it's kind of pointing us. We've already kind of made the Melchizedek connections there, but Jesus is not of this kind of physical priesthood in the way that the Levites were. This is kind of the reality versus the shadow. Verse 5 references Exodus as Moses. They serve as a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." So kind of back to a similar question I already asked, but if God said the tabernacle was just a copy and a shadow, what does that really tell us about worship? How should we really view worship? This kind of gets into our heart discussion, I guess, but
Romans 12:1 says it's a spiritual worship.
that's right, yeah. It's I think Dad kind of made the point, a lot of what was their heart should have been in it, but it was a lot of what their worship was in the Old Testament was very ritualistic driven, a lot of procedure and things in place, and it's maybe not as much of what we are supposed to be getting out of kind of what God really wants, which is our heart.
Well, we often describe the Old Testament worship as ritualistic without heart and soul. Love your God with all your heart, with all your mind, all your soul is an Old Testament passage.
It was supposed to. It was as integral to that process as anything else should have been, but we kind of get the sense that that wasn't always what was going on, and I think that danger is real to us too.
Right? You can have that issue with any group of people that they're just going through the motions. We have ritualistic motions, in our own worship that we do. We always talk about how important it is to put our heart, our soul, and our mind into it. The Old Testament required that. Often Jesus, especially with the Sadducees and Pharisees, scolded them for not having heart and soul in their service to God. But we should never think of the Old Testament as long as you did the right things in the right way on the right day, you could hate your brother and hate God and hate the world and be all right. Well, that's not true. You had to still love your brother, love God, and do it with sincerity of heart, as well as the correct animal, the correct grain, the correct day, the correct place in life.
We're really comfortable at pointing back and being like, this is how they were doing it, and I think we're in danger of doing the exact same stuff, just and it looks a little different. Less barnyard animal noises, right, coming from the background. So, totally. Now I think about earthly worship too. Kind of even our worship and kind of the way we live, is still, is that going to look the same when we get to heaven? I don't know. I get the sense again that a lot of still what we see here still seems to be kind of shadows and copies and things, right, of when we get to that real worship with God in heaven. He kind of makes his final point here, verse 6. We'll try and get this quick. So, but as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. So, a covenant with better promises. Kind of what's this warning here? He's kind of had some warnings, but for this Jewish Christian audience, these better promises. What are these better promises he's talking about? We'll get Jesus, right? We'll get to this. I know the bell just rang. We'll get to this we're going to really dig in on Wednesday. Yep.
Yeah, one thought question.
Sure.
We dismiss. If you go back to Exodus 25 and verse 40, it actually says, "And see to it that you make them according to the pattern which was shown you on the mountain." So the question is, was the first law, actually a pattern of a heavenly pattern? Because it clearly states that this was a pattern of something else that was shown to Moses on the mountain. So really, was that a pattern of a pattern?
Yeah.
There's a great deal of speculation and kind of discussion about that. Anyway, it's an interesting thing. It's not, there's like three things here, not just two.
Yeah.
Not just the pattern and then Christ.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
All right, food for thought. You got stuff to think about for Wednesday night. So, thank you guys.